I want to thank you all for joining us. And we are here this evening for our talk with Christina Weyl about her book, The Women of Atelier 17. This is our first talk of the year and of our spring term. We have others programmed, so be sure to visit our website at manhattangraphiccenter.org to register for them. You'll also be able to sign up for our mailing list, see our other events and course offerings. And you can always keep up to date with us by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Manhattan Graphic Center would like to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council of the Arts, the Sherman Foundation, the Pierre and Tanya Matisse Foundation, our members, and our other donors and friends, all who make our artist talks and other programming possible. We're very excited that our guest tonight is Christina Weyl, who is an independent scholar and curator with expertise in 20th century American printmaking. She received her BA from Georgetown University in 2005 and completed her MA and PhD in art history at Rutgers University in 2012 and 2015. Her recent book, The Women of Atelier 17, Modernist Printmaking in Mid-Century New York, published by Yale University Press in 2019, which grew from our dissertation, highlights the nearly 100 women artists who advanced modernism and feminism at Atelier 17, the avant-garde printmaking studio located in New York City between 1940 and 1955. With the support of a major grant from the Getty Foundation, she is currently co-curating an exhibition with Lauren Rosenblum for the International Print Center of New York, focusing on Margaret Lohengrin and her pioneering effort to establish the Contemporaries as a hybrid printmaking workshop gallery. She has published in Art and Print, Print Quarterly, and Archives in American Art Journal, and contributed to several anthologies and exhibition catalogs. From 2014 to 2018, she served as co-president of the Association of Print Scholars, a nonprofit professional organization she co-founded in 2014. Prior to her graduate studies, she worked for IFPDA member Gemini GEL, Joni Moisant Weyl, which represents publications of Los Angeles-based artist workshop Gemini GEL. And I'd like to point out, this is Women's History Month, so this is a great way to commemorate and celebrate women printmakers. After Christina's presentation, we'll be doing a Q&A. So if you have a question, leave it in the Q&A that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And right now, then, I'd like to hand things over to Christina.
Well, thank you, Robin, and thank you to all the other organizers, Kay and Bruno, Anita, and I think that's it, and Robin, for inviting me to speak to the Manhattan Graphics Center community. It's really a pleasure, and just looking at some of the attendees, it's nice to see some familiar names and friends out there. Let me share my screen. 1 second. So as Robin mentioned, the topic of my talk this evening is going to be the women of Atelier 17 and my recent book about this period. I focus mostly on the years 1940 to 55, but I wanted to just briefly allude to Atelier 17's longer history for those who are unfamiliar with it. So Atelier 17 was an avant-garde printmaking studio that had many locations over its almost 60-year history. It was founded in Paris, as you can see, in the 1920s, and it stayed there until the Nazi invasion became untenable to stay. And it was moved to New York during this the initial war years and stayed until 1955. But then concurrently, Atelier 17's founder, who was a British artist named Stanley William Hayter, it reopened in post-war Paris in 1950, and it remained there until he died. And throughout these 60 years, Atelier 17 is really known for being a place of technical innovation, a place where Atelier 17 trained printmakers really pushed the boundaries of what was previously thought possible in the graphic arts. They pioneered new methods of marking plates, inking them, and kind of tried to revolutionize printmaking's somewhat staid reputation or its alignment with leftist causes, and to bring it more in line with what was happening in mainstream modernism. So as we'll see, Atelier 17 had many connections with the Surrealists in interwar Paris. Also, as the studio came to New York, it became really enmeshed with post-war abstraction. And just to boil down some of the very major developments that happened at Atelier 17, these are three big ones, in my opinion. One was the revival of engraving as a fine art medium. By the time Stanley William Hayter, opened Atelier 17 in interwar Paris, engraving had become a technique that was really only used for reproduction. There was a revival of engraving in Paris around this time. There are other artists who were practicing engraving, but this became a passion of Hayter's, and the first thing that you were expected to learn when you came into to the studio. And in fact, I was able to take my own lessons in engraving at Manhattan Graphic Center. So thank you for that. The second major thing that happened, particularly in the New York years, which was my period of study, was sort of the revolution of how soft ground etching was used. As we'll see, Hayter has his own views, but many artists tried to create different textural effects using soft ground etching. And as you can see in the center, this is a really beautiful print by an artist named Sue Fuller. And that hazy lace that you see in the background is soft ground etching. And then finally, I think arguably one of the most important things that defines Atelier 17 during this mid-century period was the development of simultaneous color printmaking, which is also called viscosity printing. And Hayter and several of the members of Atelier 17 figured out how to print multiple colors on the same print, on the same plate, passing it through the press only one time, just by varying the viscosity of the ink and where the sort of hardness of the roller and where the ink fell as it was rolled over the plate. And so this is one of Hayter's prints called Cinq Personnages. So this is our man, Hayter, who you can see from about the mid-1940s, characteristically with very dirty fingernails and smoking a cigarette. He is this legendary figure known as a charismatic and passionate follower of printmaking. His love of printmaking apparently was rivaled only by his love of tennis. And we're not going to talk a whole lot about Hayter, but I am happy to take questions about him in the Q&A. But I did want to give you an example of one of his works. This is one of his most famous prints from the 1930s called Combat. It was inspired by the Spanish Civil War. Hayter spoke about how he perceived these mixed figures, and there's a horse in here, as being, people in combat, having fallen into a ravine and sort of scrambling to get out. But as you can see, it involves engraving. It involves a kind of engraving that became very popular at Atelier 17. If you can see those raised white areas, they always called that, it's been talked about in a lot of different ways, but he used a scorper. That's what he said, a like very thick and large burin tool to really gouge out the copper plate. And then there's also some soft ground etching on the left. So the classroom, the workshop, was initially located in New York City at the New School for Social Research. That was a period between 1940 and 1945. And you can see it pictured here on the lower left, along with a little description of the course offering. And then on the right, you can see Atelier 17's second location. This was a little bit further downtown, only by a few blocks, on East 8th Street. This was a loft that had been repurposed. As you can see, everything is a little bit pieced together, including the lighting and the curtains, and everything is sort of held together a little bit with tape. But it was an exciting space. And we'll talk about the differences between being at the new school and sort of becoming independent of an institution. So all told, there were probably 1,000 artists who worked at Atelier 17 over a 60-year period. Unfortunately, Stanley William Hayter did not maintain any records or like a student ledger book. So it's really difficult to, with total confidence, say how many artists studied there. But my particular interest were these women who worked there between 1940 and 55. In my book, I focus specifically on the 8 artists who you see listed on the right. And you probably are most familiar with the 2 Louises, Louise Bourgeois and Louise Nevelson. This next group, I would say people would know Dorothy Daner, but once I get a little bit further down my list, I get many blank stares. In any event, I started this list that you see on the left from a really helpful resource that was published on the 50th anniversary of Atelier 17's founding, which had an appendix of artists that had been culled from Hayter's Rolodex, from prints he had exchanged, from exhibitions that Atelier 17 had had. But I began with only 50 some odd names. And by the end, I was able to add almost 97 total. But it bothered me, speaking of Women's History Month, it bothered me a lot that I didn't know anything about any of the names beyond a few of the more prominent women. And so after my book manuscript was completed, I spent an enormous amount of time researching each one of these artists, trying to figure out what brought them to Atelier 17, what was it that they did at Atelier 17, what was the nature of their work before they were there or after, and how it might have affected the course of their career. And what was really interesting is I had to go through all kinds of resources, including newspaper aggregators. Even eBay was helpful in piecing together some of this history. But I did find that Atelier 17 in many cases had an important impact on artists' careers, and that many women who were less well-known might have been active only for a short period before they became wives or mothers, and because of the period's expectations for women, had to put their professional careers on the back burner. So anyway, I would encourage you to take a look if you're interested in learning more about any of these artists. And I would just add, sometimes I could only find the smallest little bit of information, like where they went to college, or that they were at the studio for only a few months. So more mysteries yet to learn. Today, I just want to give a really broad overview of my book, which moves from macro to micro. First, we'll discuss how technique was a really important agent of equalizing the playing field. We'll talk a little bit about the labor of printmaking and how women interfaced with all the different steps of printmaking, how the specific tools and techniques that they were using in their prints affected how critics received their work, and how other members of the studio discussed women and their innovations. And then we'll go much more broadly into how mid-century printmaking was an important avenue of professionalization for these women artists. So to begin with technique. So as I mentioned, Hayter's biography really does loom very large in studies of Atelier 17. You'll hear these anecdotes that get passed around a lot about Louise Bourgeois and how she says Hayter hated women and how he wasn't kind to them and supportive. And you'll also hear an anecdote from Louise Nevelson talking about Hayter hovering over her and perhaps hovering a little bit too closely. And I think that those are important to keep in mind. But my research in general over looking at these other 95 artists is that Hayter really did respect and encourage women and their intellectual and creative capabilities, and that he really did, appreciate artists who came in, no matter what their gender was, what country they were from, what religion they were, if they had the sort of desire to participate in the workshop's mission of coming up with new technical innovations. Hang on one second. And he could be quite sharp with his words, particularly if you didn't treat the equipment or the other workshop communal, the tables, everything. If you didn't clean up after yourself, if you got the printing blankets dirty with ink, if you broke something, I mean, he could get very cross. So he wanted everyone to have a baseline of technical proficiency. And so you see that there were actually women who could do everything from soup to nuts. He wanted you to be able to mark your plate, to ink it, to print it, and in some way edition enough prints to be able to exhibit what you had been working on. So at the New School, which is where Atelier 17 was initially, this was, I think, a really important place that leveled the playing field for all artists to be able to come in, regardless of their gender or professional status, because the New School was founded in 1919 by dissident academics from Columbia who wanted to really flatten the hierarchy of academia and put students and faculty on equal footing. And so classes were generally held in the afternoons and the evenings so that working men and women could attend after their normal day jobs. And so Hayter technically had to accept artists of any professional standing into his classroom. He did have a portfolio review. I'm sure that was intimidating, but technically speaking, he could not reject anyone because of their age or what have you. And so in the initial period at Atelier 17, when it's at the New School, you have this great mixture of artists. You have expatriates who are coming, exiles who are coming from Europe. You have Juan Miró walking in, you have Salvador Dali, you have all these really amazing, accomplished European surrealists who are kind of coming in and mingling with really young artists who are in their 20s, but also really established American artists like Reginald Marsh and Isabel Bishop, who at that point were fairly well established. One artist who was in my book, who sort of falls into this non-traditional category, is Anne Ryan, who was in her previous life, she came to Atelier 17 in her 50s. In her previous life had been a poet, a newspaper columnist, a bakery shop owner. She had been married and had 3 children. Her husband had some mental illness and had to be institutionalized. And so she became the primary breadwinner for her family, but in her 50s decided to move from New Jersey to Greenwich Village. This became really like a catalyzing experience for her. And she, through all of her connections, met Hayter, who gave her a scholarship to work at Atelier 17, a woman in her mid-50s. And she learned how to make etchings from Hayter, but also from Sue Fuller, who we'll talk about in a moment. And this became, the soft grind etchings that she made really did become instrumental to the collages that she made later. And you can see in this tiny little etching beside the sea, some of the same fishnet material that became material that she pasted onto these beautiful pieces of handmade paper. So the point is just that Atelier 17 was an educational opportunity for women and a real beacon of equality for them. Moving on to labor. This is my second chapter. I investigate very specifically the embodied significance for women of visiting Atelier 17 and taking all of these physical steps in making a print. When Atelier 17 opened up, it sort of upended traditions of printmaking, particularly when it was in Paris. At that time, with the exception of a few artists who had, presses at their own studios, many artists did hand over finished plates to master printers who were all men because they'd had apprenticeships, who then printed in addition to their work. And there were a lot of complaints sometimes by artists that the printer hadn't done what they wanted with the plate, or had over inked it, or had fixed certain areas to make them print better without telling them. And so Hayter and the Atelier 17 model was to really take ownership of the whole process, to mark, ink, and print your own work as you wanted. But so it's really important then that these women were given the opportunity to do all of this labor because they had not had those apprenticeships that the male French printers had had. And also I was thinking a lot as I was writing about how this labor interfaced with what was happening in American history at the time. Of course, starting with World War II, you have a lot of women going into factory work because they're helping to make airplanes and war material and other things that needed to be made here while men were off in the Atlantic or the Pacific fighting. And so, but there was always a real uncertainty about women becoming this Rosie the Riveter, and many portrayals that were disseminated by the Office of War Information, the government sort of propaganda, the United States propaganda machine really did portray women who were going to these factory jobs as having beautifully manicured hands, really done up makeup, and always going home to children or to their, to their families, never having been impacted by the labor that they had done. And so I thought about that a lot. It's very rare to find images of women working. Normally, you have these images like you see on the left of 4 men who are sitting around performing all the various aspects of printmaking. You see Hayter in the back pulling the press. The man at the left is inking his plate, and then the 2 sitting down are marking theirs. As I got further into my research, I did find these amazing examples of women literally getting their hands dirty, inking and wiping their plates, as you can see on the lower left. But you can imagine a woman coming home with inky hands, particularly in this wartime period, or even the post-war period where there was this backlash against women who were working outside the home, a real push to get women to work only in a domestic setting. And on the left here is an image. I'm sorry for the quality of the image. This is the kind of Office of War Information image photograph that you would see, a woman who is dolled up. Her hair has, been set in rollers, And she's being told how to do something, how to operate this machine by a fellow man, or by a man, as opposed to her exerting any kind of agency over the work that she was doing. And many of the images I had found of women operating the press were like what you see on the right, a woman who was standing beside a man who was printing. So whenever I find an image of a woman printing, it really makes me quite excited, because it does show some amount of agency. The other thing I thought a lot about was hands and hand care. And this image that you see on the right is of a magazine cover during the war. These are examples of women, putting in time to serve their country. But as you see, all the women whose hands are ungloved have beautifully manicured hands, or if they're doing heavy labor, they're wearing gloves to protect them. And this print that you see on the left is by Louise Nevelson, where you can see there's just a preponderance of ink, and so much that it kind of soaked through the bottom as it was hung up to dry. But along the edges of many women's prints, you'll see inky thumbprints. And so you know that they were really getting into it. Labor was a really important way that framed the way I thought about women's activities within the studio. I don't want to talk for too long, so I'm going to go through the next two sections. The gender of technique. So when Hayter moved the studio to New York, he gave a lot of interviews and talked a lot about what Atelier 17 was, both for sort of New York cultural audience, but also to attract students, prospective students to come. But he was very careful in all of these interviews to really differentiate what his vision of printmaking was versus how it had been perceived American art making. And so he would talk about how engraving is a skilled trade, that it's something that you must learn how to do, so apprentice in some way, but that on the flip side, that any artist is really a craftsperson, and that they have to be skilled and they have to have the talent and the creative drive to do that kind of work. So that, goal was to really realign printmaking as a sort of avenue, creative outlet of modernism, and to differentiate it from a craft. So that's great. But somewhere along the line, his goal to really revolutionize engraving made engraving into this very masculine technique. And critics would regularly describe prints and their techniques along gender lines. And to give a quick example of this, Anne Ryan, who we talked about earlier, had one of her first solo exhibitions in 1943, the same month that Stanley Hayter had a show at another gallery of his prints. And the art news critic who was describing Hayter's prints that were shown there, including Combat, talked about his control, how he was fully in command of all of the lines that he put down, and specifically called out the texture that you see on the left, the soft grain etching, in this and in other prints, and says, quote, "No practitioner except Hayter can handle the feather delicate textures produced by the introduction of extraneous substances with such a maximum of calculation and a minimum of chance." And then on the flip side, you have another critic who is describing Anne Ryan's etchings as delicate etchings, those are the critic's word, and labeled her approach as sensitive and essentially feminine. And they're using exactly the same technique. The shadow that you see in Anne Ryan's print is the same technique as what you see in Hayter's print, except hers is feminine and his is calculating and controlled. So as I mentioned, I don't know how many of our attendees have made an engraving, but if you have not, this is the tool that you use in a burin. It has roots, of course, back into the 1400s, as goldsmiths were using it to decorate body armor. And in 1940, it had really lapsed into something that was seen as reproductive, AKA feminine. And then you have a lot of proponents around Hayter, including himself, who are talking about engraving in masculine terms. A poet, a Scottish poet named Ruthven Todd, who was a collaborator with Hayter on a number of projects, claimed that the engraver's burin had degenerated. Another critic for Art News said that she believed that an engraved line in Hayter's work, or his efforts at Atelier 17, the burin left a masculine signature and the clean tension of line. And another critic said that engraving was, quote, one of the most virile and productive directions in the contemporary arts. So I would encourage many of you to, if you have not seen this video, that is a step-by-step process of Stanley Hayter making a print. It's called A New Way of Gravure. You can Google it and it's on YouTube. But I will play you a little bit of the video of him doing this and talk a little bit. He narrates the whole video. But as he is engraving this line in this film, he talks about it as if it were a plane, and swinging the plate on the pillow that's underneath it. He talks about it. You can vary the depth of the burin as if it's like a plane banking and shrapnel, sort of coming out of the ground after a bombing. So this kind of bellicose language, I think, contributed a lot to how artists perceived engraving when they came to work at the studio. Hayter also said, if a print is to be good, there has to be a violent impulse to make something. So again, there was definitely a sort of an undercurrent of gender here, of masculinity. And some of the female artists who came to Atelier 17 did not align with this vision of engraving. And Louise Nevelson probably most famously talked a lot about how when she came to Atelier 17 in the late 40s, she didn't really care for making an engraving. So most of what you see in this print on the right is etching. She recalled that she didn't want to be an expert in the tools. And I think one of the things she said was so fascinating. She didn't want to be an expert because the tools reminded her of dental tools. And, I was like, that's a weird thing to say. Why wouldn't that be appealing? But in the 1930s and 40s, only one of 55 dentists was a woman. So I think there was a little bit of this professional overlap for her that was a turnoff. So again, the complexity of these sociocultural factors in how artists, respond to different techniques was really important to my analysis. Another thing that women artists did and really excelled in when they came to Atelier 17 was soft ground etching. So I'm sure many of the people listening right now are artists and have made soft ground etching, so I'm not going to focus on it too much, but it is a technique where the ground that's put onto the copper plate remains sticky, and anything that you put onto it, sort of pulls up the ground and lets it be bitten in the acid bath. It was first discovered or first used in the 18th century by an artist named Benjamin Green, and it was mostly used for translating a drawing. So a piece of paper would be put on top of the soft grounded plate, and then a blunt stylus was used to transfer a drawing. Here's again another clip from A New Way of Gravure, where Hayter is showing how he lays down the different fabrics for soft ground. Most of these fabrics that you see are things that were used in the studio. There's old tarlatan and cheesecloth. Because it was the war, I think many artists were bringing in any kind of fabric scraps that they could, because there just was a shortage of all of these goods. But then he places the wax paper over the top and runs it through the press. And Hayter had a very particular way of looking at soft ground etching. For him, it was all about creating a supporting depth to the plate. The lines always came first. That was the first concept that you would come up with when you thought of making a plate. And then the textures were supportive of that. But you had artists like Sue Fuller, whose work I'm going to show you next, hang on, who thought of soft ground etching in a much more expansive way and featured it. As opposed to it being a supporting character, it became the primary element in her prints. And so with this print, it's called Hen. The feathers are in the feet and the beak are all engraved lines, but her mother passed away in the mid-40s, and she inherited all of these beautiful pieces of lace that her mother had either made or collected in her lifetime. And she cut them up and repurposed them into different shapes. So here into the shape of a hen. And for this, she was really criticized initially, and many critics for the mainstream art papers called her work derivative of Hayter's, called her approach the most unacademic application of technique. And so I think the subtext there is that women were not meant to be innovators and they should have followed academic protocols. But for Fuller, soft ground etching really did propel her towards abstraction. And so after she mastered soft ground technique using the materials that she inherited from her mother, she became really interested in subtracting everything and then putting it all back together again. So bringing fabric down to the lowest common denominator, string and threads, and then knotting it, or she even consulted an expert on lace about different knots and different patterns that she could put together. In this collage that you see on the left for a print called Sailor's Dream, there's even a red gift wrapping ribbon, and she loved that it created this tread-like line, but there's nothing on the print on the right that has been etched with an etching needle. It's all soft ground etching. And for this, it became a sort of expansive, it became the focus of her entire career. She took these collages and made standalone works that were called string compositions. And she had these frames made with pegs, and then she would wind pieces of thread in different colors to create these sort of optical abstractions. So she went from working in sort of figural abstraction, I would call it, to full-fledged abstraction as a result of her experimentation in soft ground etching. And I think that there is a bit of the element of the fabric, the lace that she was using. She had an appreciation for women's handcrafts in a way that was could have been fatal for her career, because, you know, if you were working in sort of feminine crafts, it meant that your art was less good. That's just sort of how mid-century criticism worked. And then only a few decades later, you have artists like Miriam Shapiro, who is one of the founding artists of the feminist art movement, who is unabashedly using lace that she's collected over the years for this important series called Anonymous Was a Woman. Of course, the title comes from Virginia Woolf, but there's a whole portfolio of these lace things that she had collected and made into soft ground etchings. But anyway, it's more stridently feminist, but it obviously nods back to those anonymous artists and handcraft lace workers who made the work, but I think also the efforts of Sue Fuller to bring lace and handcrafts into printmaking. And so just to round out our conversation quickly, I wanted to talk a little bit about how women showed their work in the mid-century period, and how they leveraged the prints that they made at Atelier 17 for professional advancement in ways that they really could not advance their careers similarly in painting or sculpture. Many of these artists were really persistent and fiercely pursued opportunities for their prints, and they would fight for chances to show their work really anywhere. And they also very selflessly promoted their fellow artists by bringing portfolios of their work to show to museum curators and to gallery owners. And so they had really strong motivations to do this because there really wasn't a great place for women in the mid-century gallery world. Men dominated the gallery scene, and it was just hard to break in. And in fact, you have artists like Louise Bourgeois. Here are just a few of the mid-century printmaking shows that were open to anyone. They were open calls, but the Brooklyn Museum's annual that began in 1947 was like the major one that everybody wanted to get into, and it was quite competitive, but there was an annual at the Library of Congress. Places like the Metropolitan Museum had one-off shows for prints. But artists like Louise Bourgeois talked about how important exhibitions like this were for her to break through and to get notice that helped build these building blocks to get to where she was. These print shows had lower barriers to entry. They were competitive, but they, in my review, are generally about 40% of women are showing in these exhibitions, which is very high by the era's standards for other shows. And it was really, these were really important places to show. You'd also could win purchase awards. So the work would enter a museum's collection, and women would often cite those achievements in their letters to other curators. I have a work in the Philadelphia Museum's collection. I have a work in, the Brooklyn Museum's collection. They're a way to substantiate your career achievements. As I said, many of these artists networked for one another, and fascinating sort of intergenerational exchange. You had an artist like Warden Day, who was quite young, who pursued opportunities outside of New York City. She had many visiting professorships, or she was in residence at certain colleges. She had this exchange with Anne Ryan, who could have been her mother, and she carried Anne Ryan's work to all over the country. And I love these letters that she sends to her. I'm really propagandizing people to buy prints, or I believe artists should freely help one another, for it all helps us in the long run, and talks about how cutthroat 57th Street galleries are. But as a result of Warden Day's efforts, Anne Ryan got several of her woodcuts placed in collections in places like Kentucky and in Missouri. And these were really important sales for Anne Ryan, again, to substantiate what she had made a really sharp, turn in her life and her career. So that's just an example of networking and exchange. Dorothy Daner, who you see here on the left, and Louise Nevelson on the right, met at Atelier 17 and remained friends throughout their life. And even though Nevelson became very, busy and very famous for her sculpture, they remained friends. But at one point, Nevelson was out doing a Tamarin fellowship at the Tamarin Lithography Workshop and recommended Dorothy Daner make prints there as well. And after a few cycles, Daner was able to schedule her time there and make her own prints. So again, it was always speaking up for your fellow artist. And there were much more concerted efforts on the part of some artists to talk about the discrimination they felt because of their gender. And Warden Day was on the leading edge of that in terms of the artists who were at Atelier 17. And you can see her in her older years at the center of that photograph on the right. And then Dorothy Daner is on the left and Lily Enty is on the right. But they had these sort of salons where they talked about discrimination that they felt. And in the late 50s, Warden Day had wanted to organize an all women's exhibition, asking, among others, her fellow artists from Atelier 17 to participate. The show didn't get off the ground, but it is an example of this awareness that they face these barriers as women in the arts, and that they, really wanted to get beyond that. And so Warden's idea was to shock the critics with the level of work that women artists were able to produce. So I just think it's important to remember these artists, even the ones who are so unknown to us, because Atelier 17 offered them all a moment where they could excel, where they could have a work put into an exhibition in a major museum, and where for just a brief period, they were able to contribute to what was happening in mid-century America in the modern art movement. So I'll stop here, and I'd be very happy to take any questions that people have. I've not been watching the Q&A, so if there are some questions, I will look now.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. That was just like really, really fascinating. So yeah, if you have questions that are in the Q&A, we can go to those now. And I'm looking for, so if anyone has any questions, please enter them in the Q&A right now. I'm not seeing any, no open questions.
I think there was the one that somebody sent earlier via email.
That email,
to answer while people are thinking.
Let me see what that is. Okay, so I'll read out this question, and it was from Keith Sheridan. And he had emailed this to us earlier in the day. I find works created at Hayter's Atelier 17 workshops often exhibit very recognizable qualities of innovation, dynamism, and energetic vibrancy. These works also often share a consistency of gestural expressiveness and printmaking technique. In your view, did Hayter, in his role as teacher, mentor, and collaborator, truly support individual creative expression? Or did his extensive knowledge of printmaking and his strong personal mode of expression foster a kind of unsuppressed imitation?
So I think that's a great question, and hopefully, some of the examples I gave tonight might have helped dispel that. I think that he had a very set protocol when people came in, that you needed to learn all the techniques, and he started people on what he called an experimental plate. It was generally like a 4x6 or maybe 5x7, where you had to try everything and really try to destroy the plate and to understand how to make an aquatint, how to use soft ground, how to engrave. But I think the idea that he somehow controlled what people did is not, really what happened. And he really did encourage people to take their own course and make their own innovations. And I think that this happens in a lot of workshops where you might see similar work, because everybody was working together. I mean, I think when you look across mid-century painting, you see a lot of similar characteristics. But I don't think Hayter was controlling and said, if you want to be part of the studio, you have to do work that looks like this. I think it's just a result of having shared and cohabitated in the same workshop for some time. I'm sure that happens today in various school workshops and perhaps even at Manhattan Graphic Center.
Okay. So our next question is from Ruth Moskowitz. Did any of the artists do lithographs or woodcuts at Atelier 17?
So lithographs, definitely no. There was a litho press in Atelier 17 space at the New School, but I think it was used by another workshop, another class. There was a workshop, woodcut class offered later on. That's why you see sometimes woodcuts are shown with Atelier 17 things. So Ward and Day taught that class, as did Louis Schenker. And the idea was, just to stimulate interest in modernist expression in the graphic arts. But lithography was taught as of the late 1940s, I think 1947 or 48 by Bob Blackburn at his own workshop, and also at the Art Students League, among other places.
Okay. So our next question is from Patricia Bronstein. Is there anything equivalent now for women?
Great question. I think that women have made such advances in the printmaking field that they don't need their own, separate sort of studio. I think in the 70s there was a place called the Women's Workshop. I'm not going to get the name right, in New York, upstate New York. But women made such advances in the graphic arts that many of the workshops that are open today are operated by women. So they are the master printers for those establishments.
Okay. Marla Hoffman is asking, what is the difference between aquatint and soft ground?
So I think for that, I would tell you there are a couple of great resources that are out there that talk about some of these techniques on a more micro level that are really interesting to look at. I know that the Metropolitan Museum put together a whole tutorial about intaglio processes and printmaking. In general, I think there's even woodcut and lithography, but I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. And a colleague of mine who was a fellow at RISD put together a show about 19th century French etching. I think it was called Altered States, again, at the RISD Museum. And she has an online resource, which is also quite helpful about different techniques. So I would point you there to learn more.
Okay. Our next question is from Colleen Pike Blair. Did any of the artists you research work at Atelier 17, as in helping run the studio and train students?
Yeah, so again, that was another opportunities that women had when they were at Atelier 17. In exchange for tuition, some artists became, did menial tasks like cleaning up, but also many became studio monitors. So they were available at times that Heder was not there to teach. So Sue Fuller was a studio monitor in the 40s and was also asked to edition some of the prints by some of the surrealists who were coming through the workshop. And later on, some of the artists who were part of the studio actually helped to manage the studio after Heder had gone back to France. So it did offer those kinds of professional opportunities as well. But a few, I would say a handful of these artists went on and started their own workshops as a result of having learned what a print studio could be. An artist named Ruth Leaf founded a workshop in Douglaston, Queens. And that was open to artists. And then there was another artist who opened her own workshop in the Woodstock area.
Okay, so we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Isn't it possible that Heder was a supporter of women and also made some of them feel uncomfortable? I think Louise Bourgeois had issues with many men, and it was pretty common during that period for men to have no boundaries.
Yeah, and I definitely think that you have to sort of take a step back, unfortunately. And yeah, there was only one comment in all of my research of a woman who felt that she had been inappropriately touched, that there had been a criticism at the table. They were doing a group crit, and Hayter was moving around the table and had inadvertently spilled ink on this woman's clothing and then tried to help her clean it. And she did not want his help. That was the only comment that I ever heard where it felt like the contact was an inappropriate level. I think you have to remember what the 1940s and 50s were, and the kind of comments and the kind of hovering that to us today would be very inappropriate, but based on what the 40s and the 50s were not out of line. So I think it's possible that, yes, he did make them feel uncomfortable, but it was a different era. You know, it doesn't make it right, but it was a different era.
Maggie Block is asking, were there any other print workshops like Atelier 17 in Paris or New York? Were there spin-offs in New York when Atelier 17 returned to Paris? And why did Atelier 17 leave New York City?
Okay, so I think one of the interesting little wrinkles that I found is that Hayter is known to have learned how to make his own prints from a Polish engraver when he was in Paris in the middle of the 1920s, whose name was Joseph Hecht. And what I found was sort of fascinating is that, in fact, he learned from a woman, made his first prints with a woman whose name was Mary Huntoon, who was a woman from Kansas who had studied at the Art Students League with Joseph Pennell. And as a result of kind of putting all these pieces together, I found that there were a couple of ateliers in Paris where you could go and learn how to make, specifically how to make prints, including Joseph Hecht's engraving atelier. So I think there's a lot more that we could learn about where women were learning how to make prints in interwar Paris. In terms of spin-offs in New York, that's kind of where the next project I am is picking up, which is that everybody was sort of sad when Atelier 17 closed, and everybody wanted to recreate that magic. And Bob Blackburn did have the lithography workshop, which was an important resource, but that was kind of what Margaret Lohengrin was attempting to do with the Contemporaries Gallery, which was a space that was up on Madison Avenue, but it aligned a commercial gallery with a workshop, which was kind of unprecedented in the New York area. Atelier 17 never had a gallery. They always relied on other galleries to exhibit members' work or have group shows. So, and then the Contemporaries became Pratt Graphic Center. So you have a couple of different places that crop up as Atelier 17 is closing in the 50s. So Blackburn, the Contemporaries, Pratt. Why did Atelier 17 close? It closed in New York because Hayter had left, and he had really devoted all of his efforts into keeping the Paris studio open. Being the gallery director, or being the director of Atelier 17, was a title. There was no salary. You were responsible for balancing the budget and making sure that the tuition was all paid, that the rent was paid, and it was really tough. And many of the artists who took over that job had to teach in other institutions to keep their own houses, their own apartments, the rent paid. And after some time, it just became untenable for people to be doing that without a salary. So it is not for want of interest in keeping it going. It just was not financially viable by 1955.
Okay, this probably ties into that. This is also from an anonymous attendee. Couldn't women also work at Pratt? But I think you were sort of touching on that in your last answer.
Yeah, so you could work at the Art Students League for sure. And as I mentioned, Margaret Lohengrin opened her workshop in 1951, but it really wasn't a big deal until it got a major grant from the Rockefeller Foundation in 1956, and it became part of Pratt. So the sort of time that Atelier 17 ends is about the time that the the contemporaries and Pratt become a more robust organization.
Okay. So we have Mary Sherwood Brock. When I met June Wayne, she also mentioned the sexism in the art world that she had to deal with in establishing Tamarind in LA. Often people she had hired were given credit for the success of the studio over her own accomplishments. This sexism often came from the establishment art world that was based in New York City at the time. This issue happened mostly while she was busy running the studio, and she focused on connecting the history later on. June was also a very close friend of Louise Nevelson, and June credited Louise's advice. Oh, and this continues. But June mentioned inviting women art students to come to Tamarind to learn to become printers, and they would wind up in high heels and skirts. Or show up in high heels and skirts, excuse me.
So the great thing about the next project I'm working on is I can plug another scholar whose work will probably be coming out in a few years. My co-curator, Lauren Rosenblum, is studying, among others, June Wayne's efforts to start Tamarind. And there's definitely a lot of issues of sexism there, and how June became a sort of figure of the feminist art movement. But when she started Tamarind in the early 60s, and they formulated the Tamarind printer training program, they did not admit women for many years, for many reasons, among others, that they felt women were not physically capable of carrying stones and doing the labor of wiping the stones and pulling the press and cranking it and all that stuff. So it wasn't until several years after Tamarind had been founded that women were invited to become part of the Tamarind training program. And there are letters to document this. And I do think that there is a little bit of credit that's given to some of the men who did help run the workshop. But June, like Margaret Lohengrin, they did important work as organizers. They got the money for their institutions, and they had the vision for what printmaking could become in the United States.
We have a comment from Ruth Moskovich. It's actually very interesting. Manhattan Graphic Center is a successor to Pratt Graphics, so in a way, a successor to Italian Film.
That's very funny. I did not know that. I think it's sort of interesting to think about also how presses get moved around, and where presses, their lineage and where they go. So I'd be interested to know if any of the presses that are at Manhattan Graphic Center are former Pratt presses.
Have to look into that. No, the thing about Manhattan Graphic Center that I'll just say, there might be other people attending this that are aware of this, but Manhattan Graphic Center started when Pratt Manhattan closed their print shop. A group of printmakers there got together needing a space to work, and that was how Manhattan Graphic Center started. So I guess there is some sort of link there.
It's really interesting. I guess I hadn't realized that, because I'm trying to get sort of into the 60s and not go beyond that. I mean, I know obviously Pratt had a longer history than that, but I have to rein in my years somehow.
Then Paul Fowley is asking, sorry if I missed it, but did you say the actual address in New York City? I'm not sure that.
I don't know if I did, sorry. The studio had 3 locations in New York City. The first was at the New School, which is on West 12th Street, and then in the historic Joseph Urban building. And then I think that's 66, if I'm not mistaken, 66 West 12th. Then it moved just down the street to 41 East 8th Street, so just off 5th Avenue. And then in the mid 50s, it moved to another location on 6th Avenue. And that was the final place that it was, only for a couple of years. But if I didn't mention it, the reason that Atelier 17 has its name is for the final address it had in Paris before it moved to New York. It was at 17 Rue Campagne Premiere. So it became Atelier 17. And that wasn't until the mid 1930s. So I have often thought that before that, before Atelier 17 was really more famous and they were doing group exhibitions, I think that people probably called it Chez Bill or Chez Haters. And they would just kind of like go work in Haters. It was his studio apartment. So they would just kind of go over there and work at the appointed times.
Okay, and there's a comment that I'm just going to read to you from Jamie Tabak. Christina, thank you very much for bringing women printmakers into the light. As you know, I worked for Ruth Leaf for 7 years and then moved on to Krishna Reddy. They were interesting times.
Yes, and
so,
Ruth is the artist I mentioned who started her own studio, and I do know Jamie, so it's nice that she's here.
There's one last comment from, I don't know if this is the same anonymous attendee or another one. Can you please let me know who the other woman, I think they mean me, in the Zoom is, not Christina, the other person. My name is Robin Sharon, and I'm on the Manhattan Graphic Center management team. So that's who I am. So I guess if there's no other questions, I think not, we will, I guess, wrap this up. So Christina, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. Thanks everyone for the great questions and being here. I would like to also remind you to visit our website at manhattangraphiccenter.org to sign up for future talks, see our other events and classes. You can also sign up for our mailing list and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So I guess that's it. I guess we're done. So thank you so very much.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening.